So in this segment, I'm going to give you the most important question that you can ask in trying to map out and identify sentence types. The most important question that you can ask is not what is my sentence type, but it's this. So too often when we start looking at our sentences and start trying to think about, well, what kind of sentence am I working with? Or how do I punctuate it? Or what do I do? We make the mistake of assuming that we're working with a sentence. What I want you to do when you're looking at parts of a sentence to understand relationships in the sentence or punctuation or sentence types is to first ask this question. Is it, and it refers to the word group I'm looking at, is my word group a phrase or a clause? Is it a phrase or a clause? If you'll first ask this question, you are going to much more easily be able to answer punctuation questions, agreement and reference questions, and sentence type questions. Let me put some examples up and we'll talk through those. Okay, so I have up here on the board a sentence. After eating, Leslie took her test. Now, let's say I'm trying to figure out what type of sentence I'm dealing with. Here's the mistake that so many students make. They go, oh, I've got a word group. Is this dependent or independent? Because I'm trying to figure out what type of clause I have. Well, you've skipped this important question. Every time I'm analyzing a word group in my sentence, the first question that you ask yourself is my word group a phrase or a clause? Now, before we start identifying in this sentence what's a phrase or what's a clause, let's just simply talk about how do we have a clause and what is a phrase. A phrase is a word group. A phrase is a word group. Let me give you an example. Okay, in this sentence here in the red, I have, I will eat bananas and drink juice. Now, I have here two verb phrases. This is my fanboy coordinating conjunction, and in fact, it's linking two verb phrases. A phrase typically has a subject or a verb, so a noun or a verb, but not both. When I have both a subject and a verb, then I'm dealing with a clause. It takes my phrase and it makes it into a clause. So let's relook at this sentence. And this first part of my sentence is actually a clause because I have my subject and my verb. And after the fanboy, drink juice is a phrase. It's another verb phrase. So remember, I will eat bananas and drink juice. That is one single clause because it has a subject and a verb. You can have multiple verbs in the clause. So I will eat bananas and drink juice. However, if I put in I will eat bananas and I will drink juice, now I've introduced another subject to go with this verb, I will drink juice, and I have a clause. So fanboy words can connect words, phrases, or clauses. So in this case, I have I will eat bananas, subject and a verb, and I will drink juice, subject and a verb. Two clauses. So let's go back up here to this word group. After eating, Leslie took her test. And what I'm trying to figure out is, do I have multiple clauses in the sentence, or do I have a combination of a phrase and a clause? Let's analyze. I've got an introductory word group, and typically if I have an introductory group or something offset by a comma, I want to analyze. Am I dealing with a phrase, a word group, in other words, or a clause? Well, let's isolate after eating. After eating, again, don't start thinking, oh, is this a dependent clause or is it independent? What type of sentence am I dealing with? Ask yourself, is it a phrase or a clause? So after eating has a verb form, but no subject. So therefore, after eating is simply a phrase. Leslie took the test. We now have a subject and a verb. So I have here a clause. And this is in another segment in terms of sentence mapping. But if I were to look at this sentence, I have one clause. Therefore, this would be a simple sentence. I'm going to give you two more examples, and I want you to look through these to help determine, is this word group a phrase or a clause? Okay, so again, when I'm looking at word groups and analyzing my sentences, I want to first ask myself when I see a word group, is the word group a phrase or is it a clause? And that's my first question that I ask. Is it a phrase or a clause? The second question, I'm going to kind of make this into a formula, is if it's a clause, then is it independent or dependent? So these are the two basic questions I need to ask before I tackle sentence mapping, punctuation, and agreement. Is the word group a phrase or a clause? And if C, then I or D. In other words, if it's a clause, is it independent or dependent? So let's look at several sentences and go through this process. First of all, Bill took the folder. In order to figure out, again, is it a phrase or a clause, I have to remember that a clause has what two components? Both a subject and a verb. So in this sentence, Bill is my subject, took is the verb. So I know that I'm dealing with a clause. If it's a clause, now I can go to that next step to say, is it independent or dependent? Well, all independent means is that that clause can stand alone as its own sentence. It's not dependent on any other information in the sentence to be a standalone. So think independent. Yay, can I do a little independent cheer? I'm independent. I'm my own sentence. Well, Bill took the folder. We've identified first that it's a phrase or a clause, that it's a clause because it has a subject and a verb. Then we say, can it do the little cheer and say, yay, I'm independent, I can stand alone? In fact, it can. That's a full and complete sentence. So here we have an independent clause. Now let's go to our next sentence. Remember I mentioned that often if we have a word group offset by a comma, that's an indicator we need to analyze if we have a phrase or a clause. So before leaving the meeting, Bill took the folder. Now I already know that Bill took the folder because it has a subject and a verb, that this is an independent clause. Well, what about the new content that I added to the sentence before leaving the meeting? Remember, when I'm analyzing my sentences to figure out if I have a whole and complete sentence and then how to punctuate it, make it agree, and map it out, I need to first ask, is this word group a phrase or a clause? So I'm going to ask myself that before leaving the meeting. Is it a phrase or a clause? Well, we have no subject. I have a verb type here. I have a gerund verb, but I have no subject. So this is, in fact, a phrase. This is, in fact, a phrase. So I have one independent clause. Phrases are sort of neutral, and they don't, phrases don't impact the type of sentence that I have. This is one independent clause. Let's look at one more sentence. I'm going to change this just slightly, and we'll reevaluate. Okay, now our sentence says, before he left the meeting, Bill took the folder. Again, Bill took the folder. We know that this is an independent clause. Let's look at our prefatory or introductory phrase or clause, figure out what it is. Before he left the meeting. Is it a phrase or a clause? Well, we've got a subject. I'm actually going to put a little dotted line because it's a secondary subject. And left, we have our secondary verb. It's not the main subject and verb, but we do have a secondary subject and verb. So is it a phrase or a clause? This is a clause. I'm dealing with a clause. So before he left the meeting, since it's a clause, is it independent or dependent? Well, can before he left the meeting do a little cheer? And no, he can't. It's not a standalone sentence. Before he left the meeting is dependent on additional information in order to stand alone. So I know that this introductory phrase is in fact a dependent clause. So this sentence has one independent clause and one dependent clause, which we know is a complex sentence. So remember, when you're getting ready to map out your sentences, when you're analyzing word groups, the first question that you ask yourself is the word group a phrase or a clause?